Testing. 1, 2, 3, 4. Scott, can you hear me? Well, you can, but Kathy, can you hear me? Can Scott hear me? You can't? All right, before I begin, let's cover some issues. One, if you could remember in your prayers, Gail and Pat, clearly they're not getting along. They're at opposite sides of the table. No, I don't want to embarrass. Larry, thank you for being the referee. I don't, oh, it must be terrible. Larry is also open for doing marriage counseling if everybody needs him. Also, thank you, Connie, for doing all the cooking. Very nice of you. Gina, with permission from her husband, made the coffee, so wherever Gina is. Oh, Gina's not here. She left. Oh. And then lastly, we do have sign-ups for the next couple weeks, so if you want to think about signing up and bringing some sort of treat. Connie really does always cooks for a small army, but even if it's donuts, think about doing something. So why don't we start in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. So welcome to another class on church architecture and beauty. I really haven't got to the churchy part yet. I won't till next week. But to me, it's really important to kind of go over big history. So I'm really just at megalithic structures. Mega, obviously, it means big stone. But I'm still in the Neolithic time period. Now, next week, we're going to do what God has to say about architecture and architecture in the early church. Then we'll go Romanesque, then Gothic, then Baroque, which I hate, and move on. But here's the thing. We need to, not so much this class, but what's going to happen is that I'm going to give more and more my opinion. My opinion is not always right. It's just 99% of the time. But opinion is very subjective. So when I give my opinion, don't think that it's from on high. It's just my opinion. Does that make sense? And when you give your opinion, just know if it conflicts with me, you're wrong. Because things like, art and architecture, God does say some things, and history says some things. But also, there's a lot of opinion. And so I want to just, this class, go over megalithic architecture. And start with this story in the Bible of Jacob. If you remember Jacob, he's a very selfish young man. He runs away. He says this prayer to God because his brother's trying to kill him. God, I'll believe that you exist if you give me a beautiful wife and children and lots of wealth. And the name Jacob means trickster. And God says in this dream, oh, Jacob, I'll take you up on that because I am a better trickster than you are. And he sees, and I'll get into this at the end, these angels running up and down this really stairway, but it's a ziggurat. I'll explain that later. Do you guys know what a ziggurat is? Really, you don't? And you're from... anyhow, it's this, you could say stairway, but it really means temple. I could show you really quick. What's that? Ziggurat? Oh, yeah, Zikora. Sorry, it's going to take... This is a ziggurat. So it's an ancient temple. It's a mountain. And you have these stairways. So when it says stairway, when Jacob has this dream of a stairway, it's not like a stairs like climbing your house. It's this stairway where you go up, and the top was where God would dwell, on the top of the mountain. And so he has this dream. Now I have to get back. He has this dream of angels going up and down on this stairway, this ziggurat. Anyhow, and this was a Jewish belief, he says, oh, this must be one of the places where from earth you can enter heaven. Like, this is a small place. So he when he goes to sleep, he uses this stone, and it's a curved stone, as his headrest. And so when he wakes up, he says, this must be one of the portals into the divine. And so he piles up the rocks and puts the curved rock that he uses as a pillow on top so it points to heaven. And then he does this weird thing. He pours oil all over the rocks, and it's a sacred spot. And then years later, I love this, years later he takes his sons and he shows them this pile of rocks that he built that points up to heaven. And like, I love this because, you know, if you're a teenage kid and your dad comes to show you a pile of rocks, you know, they're probably like, oh God, the old man and his rocks again. And Jacob was like, no, this is a sacred spot. I was selfish, and then the next day I met your mother, and my whole life changed. And interestingly enough, the pile of rocks that he poured rock over gets built up into a temple. Now, the odd part is archaeologists found all these dozens of piled rock monuments that from Neolithic times marked a sacred spot. And guess how ancient people made these pile of rocks sacred? They poured oil over them. And this sounds kind of strange, but do you know why the pyramids are where they are? Because this man has a dream of the divine. And he has this mystical vision of this burning place where the divine met him in a dream, just like Jacob. And so, because he's a king, he demands the pyramids be built there. There's no logical reasons why the pyramids are where they are, except for the fact that, like Jacob, he had this dream. And they anointed it with oil. So think about this. The Jerusalem temple is on a rock that was anointed. And like every Catholic church, how do you bless a Catholic church? Oil. And what do you pour the oil over? The altar. And what's in the middle of an altar? A rock. Altars are made out of wood and rock. So in every altar, there's this blessed rock. The door, the church, the altar, is this doorway into heaven. And so it picks it up. So this sounds kind of strange. I want to go back and talk about Neolithic times again, and just the importance of an altar. In the background of Neolithic, remember, at Paleolithic, where we're nomads, then Neolithic, the great revolution was farming. Farming changed the world. And with farming, you could have larger populations and the beginning of cities. And humanity starts to spread out. So from 6,000 to 4,500 BC, humanity is spread out all across Europe to Ireland, everywhere. And as human beings spread until they can't go any farther, once they stop, they channel this energy from expanding to building monuments, places to meet the divine. And these places were also places to meet the dead. And so they have this transition from expanding out to expanding up, beyond time. And this is called the megalithic movement. Megalithic, big stone. So human beings start to build these huge stone structures to remember the dead and as places to contact the divine. So once again, religious monuments are this mixture of architecture, also astronomy and art, and the megalithic structures are not built for housing or defense, but for ritual. Rituals for contact with the dead and for healing. So when people say, well, religion is invented, religion has been around with human beings. People started to build these huge structures for worship. They weren't built, none of them, for palaces for the wealthy or homes, but places to worship. Now, I know I get excited about this. If I lose you at any point, raise your hand. I invented this gesture. But the amazing thing is that people thought that, the pyramids were built, right? The pyramids were built, and once in these city centers where you had knowledge of building, it then spread out to Ireland and all these other distant places. That theory is called the theory of diffusion, that the civic centers, it rippled out, diffused out from knowledge where the pyramid and places were built. Then carbon dating came about in the 60s and showed, wow, that is completely wrong. Ethnographics, so why it's wrong is this. No, what happened? Pyramids came later. Pyramids are later. The first thing that are built are these ancient megalithic spots. And the odd part, this is amazing, the ethnographic similarities from Papua New Guinea to Madagascar to Ireland, the Middle East, all these monuments are being built at the same time. Knowledge didn't diffuse out. It seems to be something just within the entire human species. We have this need to build big things to contact the divine. It didn't come from the pyramids as they thought. So it's up and out. And in Neolithic times, people built these sacred mounds, and then caves in them. And whether it's Stonehenge or these other megalithic structures, the Acropolis, they always have this kind of parallelism of building up then in. So to get to the Acropolis, you have to go up and then in. The pyramids are stylized mountains. The ziggurat that I mentioned before, it's a sacred mountain with a cave. Stonehenge is both a mountain. These are ancient. I know, they look modern, right? They're not. They're ancient. We always think if something's modern, it's better. But these are incredibly ancient, huge stone structures that were meant for the divine. And the odd part is there's this theme of not only in and out, but think of it like the Garden of Eden. Remember, the Garden of Eden was on top of a mountain. The tree of life was at the very, very top. Heaven in the Old Testament is called the mountain of God. And so these megalithic structures employed astrology up, but also they're designed to give you a direction in your life. And so likewise, Catholic churches are supposed to have these high ceilings because it's supposed to have this verticalness, that it's calling us up, but also this direction towards the altar that begs us forward and communal. I'm going to get it more into this next week, but okay, here's part of the criticism. One thing I don't like about our church is the ceiling. And I've asked Bill, our facilities guy, if he could put like a huge dome on it. And I always say to him, do you think by Friday you could get that dome up there? And it's just hard to work with him. But like Catholic churches, even and it's not just a law for a law's sake. Think about it, megalithic times. You had a building up and in, and direction. When you walk into these ancient temples, there's a direction towards an altar. And I'm going to get into that later. That there's a sense of direction. Now, one more criticism about, and I'll get into this next week, our church, is that in the 70s, and I like it, I'm just offering criticism, a fan-shaped churches started, and they're really great. They have some positive stuff. I'll get into that later. But the problem is they lose direction. Like it's just, like, no offense, St. Pius, you know what the image of St. Pius was when they built it? A lecture hall. A lecture hall doesn't have directionality. Doesn't have a high ceiling. Even ancient Buddhist temples, like in Cambodia, the temple is this mystical mountain that orientates. It literally is orientated astronomically between summer and winter solstice and the equinoxes. So it's this idea that, wow, in architecture, heaven and earth, the skies, is artistically structured. It's up and in. What does religion say about this common impulse to connect something beyond us, but also architecturally, give us a sense of direction. This says something about the roots of religion. It's about remembering the past, but also supposed to be giving us direction in the future. That's what religious architecture is supposed to do. So in the megalithic, as human beings start to expand, they build these megalithic monuments. And the first one is called a menhir. Now, a menhir, this sounds kind of strange. Menhir, it's a standing stone. It's usually oval, and they're found all over the place. Neolithic times. They're carved by the glaciers, and menhir just means standing stone. And they marked, this sounds kind of strange, they marked huge events, such as, this sounds strange, adoption of a child, often a place for the dead. It's a place where people would meet and pray. This was the very beginning of church architecture. So there are monuments to great people. And then you can see this evolution from menhir to, this is a cornac. So this is a cornac is a whole row of stones, usually as large as a football field. So that's a karnak. Once again, same thing, they're just in rows. And then, this sounds kind of strange, then from karnaks, human beings built what's called a dolmen. A dolmen just means a stone table. I actually kind of messed up, but the dolmen is they take these big stones and then create a table. And then they're covered with earth, and they became really a church. Does that make sense? Inside is a church. We're just looking at the bones of it, but after they had built it up, they would put dirt all around it and then really make the inside a cave. In fact, we have not a parishioner, she belongs to St. Thomas, Anita Dolman. Do you know? So, what's that? Ireland, all over the place. Anita Dolman, every time I meet her in my head, I always think, oh, there's Stone Table. She wouldn't get the joke, but it's an early church. There's these huge domes with this megaton flat stone on top. It's a stylized mountain and cave, and these stones weigh about 50 tons. So, and they're always orientated towards an astrological orientation, summer and winter solstice. And there are also grave sites for clans. And they're usually in the center of several farms where they would come together. So human beings then built this. We're still in Neolithic times. Once again, a dolmen. And then what they did is, here's the dolmen, right? And I love this. Then humans have to add a passageway. Why do you have to if this is where you would offer the altar and the meal for those who have died, why do you think human beings had to build, because this is a lot of work, tons, a passageway? Because human beings, this sounds kind of strange, religious architecture is that it's not just up and in, but it needs direction. That somehow entering this dolmen is a huge passageway, leaving the world behind, entering the sacred. So these are called gallery graves because there's these stylized. Now, one thing I forgot is, so this is going to make sense in it. This is a gallery grave. Notice how they put the dirt over the top? Is a cromlech. And you know how they used to have them in rows? Then they put them in circles. These huge monuments in circles. And then from circles, they created these passageways. And the passageways are always decorated. Now, I got to just keep repeating, swirls are really important. A swirl means some sort of passageway initiation. And the caves, these caves, were used for initiation. Outside the caves, once again, places for the dead. Inside, an altar where you'd have a meal. With these megalithic structures, there are places where you would journey for the dead. And here's the odd part. When you buried the dead, it was filled with personal items for the deceased. There were items that the deceased would need for the afterlife. So apparently, ancient human beings did believe that you could take it all with you. But this says something about prehistoric human belief in an afterlife. Now, this sounds kind of strange. There's these dolmens here in the United States, in the East Coast. Did you guys know that? So it's really, this little interesting U.S. history. Thomas Jefferson decided these Indian burial mounds, he wanted to figure out what they were. So America's first archaeologist was actually Thomas Jefferson. And there are these haystack monuments, is what they called them. And one of them was on his property, and he wanted to discover what it was. And previously, the myth was, in colonial times, that these haystack monuments, dolmens, they couldn't have been built by the Native Americans. You know, they weren't smart enough. And so what preceded the Native Americans were what they called, quote-unquote, the mound builders, that built these huge religious monuments. And so that was the builders. Now, they kind of thought they had to be either Russian or Egyptians. And do you know what religion picked this myth up? Oh, Joseph Smith. You guys don't know anything about Mormonism? She said she had enough problem with. So Joseph Smith, this was a myth in colonial times. And so Joseph Smith says, oh, yes, these mounds were actually built by white people who were Jews who got lost on their way out of Egypt and came to the United States, and that was the first Mormons. And then the Native Americans killed them off. But Thomas Jefferson wanted to know what was in these. And so he cuts into one slice, and what he found out when he sliced, and he replaced it all because otherwise he would have been a looter, but he took notes of everything. And he realized these dolmens were burial sites. And the artifacts prove that they were ancient Native American burial tombs that you would have a meal with. So he debunked the kind of idea of the myth builders. So he was really the first archaeologist. But the odd part is that, remember, at the first stage, Paleolithic human beings, they buried their dead in, not Paleolithic, what's a word for old? Yeah, Paleolithic. Paleolithic human beings buried their dead on the entrance of these sacred caves. Neolithic human beings, if you remember, where did they bury their dead? In like Chepahuic, which all the Neolithic sites are in Turkey. I mentioned this 2 weeks ago. Not just in the ground. They buried it in chapels. They had these cities. They built these mud cities, but they buried the dead on the floors of their chapel. And in their chapel, the center of their chapel was an altar. Very good. Now, Neolithic human beings in the megalithic, they're building these huge stone palaces for the deceased with personal items. And the living community were in these farms all around it. And so you could go and visit these places, these shrines. But think about it. They were noted for connecting the living with the dead, living with this other world of the divine, and they were places of healing. But they're these gigantic mausoleums for the ancestors, and they lived for hundreds and hundreds of years around these. And so these farming families, they were always in contact with the dead, that the dead are still among us. You could visit them in these huge monuments. And so you had these huge tracts of farming lands, but also you had in the middle of them, clans could travel to these monuments. And they'd burn fields even back then. And so it's kind of connected with this power to remember. And then they get even fancier. Like this one is in Britain. So That's actually France. But the dolmens are covered with dirt, and then the entrance is always pointed towards the winter equinox, solstice, thank you, solstice. This is from the outside, and this is a very famous one. Anybody know where this one is? Very, very famous. Oh, okay, you get to have another cup of coffee. Ireland. This is New Grange, and all these places are also places where you would have a feast on an altar. And so remember, religion seems to be this nexus between architecture and remembering the ancestors and feastings and offerings and this communal cohesion. Now, New Grange gets even bigger with even more and more spirals all over the place. Actually, all Neolithic human beings love the spiral when it's connected to the dead. It means a passageway. The Irish upped it by putting trispirals. I don't know why the tri ones, nobody knows. But and they'd often put leaves around the spirals. So somehow the spiral also means this passageway, but the leaves seems to indicate some sort of rebirth or new life. And so you have this New Grange, which, remember, the pyramids aren't even built yet. This is incredibly ancient. And you have this passageway decorated with all these things, but when light from the winter solstice would go down the passageway, it would hit at the altar. So it marked just at, it was also an astronomical calendar. But I love how it harnessed the power of the sun. And this is an extraordinary effort to build such a huge place. So it's unbelievable that people couldn't believe that ancient people could have built such big things. And to understand Stonehenge, you have to put the circle back into context. It was used for burial rituals, but also used ritually for healing and connection. Now, this is important. Even with Stonehenge, they had this myth that the Druids built it. Druids don't even exist yet. Druids won't exist for hundreds and hundreds of years. But don't you love this, how it matches, uses astronomy with great precision, that sun coming through the lintel and the door. And Stonehenge is really the same thing. It wasn't built by the Druids. Henge means a circle of chalk, that they'd have this circle of chalk circle on the very outside. Also, once again, all these spirals, the spirals that are found from Asia Minor to France to Ireland, we don't know what it means. As I said, it means some sort of passageway. First, it was done with wood posts. That doesn't really matter. And then they would add a roof on it. And what you're seeing in Stonehenge is, with over the years, the roof had disappeared. Does that make sense? So you're just looking at the bones of really an ancient cathedral. But they're massive. Now, they would have been covered. So that's a does that make sense? Because Gail, you look like... They don't really know, but they did find in Ireland these hard, round balls with the spirals on them, and they rolled them. But it would have taken great effort because they came from, miles and miles away in the middle of this farming land, and it united all the clans. And once again, winter, summer solstice, all of it is this huge astronomical clock as well. These stones here, these smaller ones, these blue ones I'll talk about in a second, those are connected with healing. So there's 5 major gateways with one huge arch and 4 lesser ones. And the arches are stylized. So they just lead to the center, to the offering. Now, you'll hear this about human sacrifices being offered at Stonehenge. That's not true. Hundreds of years later, the Druids would do that. But not the ancient Neolithic human beings. It was actually, and they actually found like the digging tools, which were antlers. And the purpose for Stonehenge was religious. One, for ancient funeral rites. They actually found the earliest gold in Britain to be found in these graves. Secondly, it was for healing rites. Water were poured over the blue stones, which made them give this blue shimmer to it. And they were used with these pools of water for healing. So in other places, they found these same blue stones connected with water and healing ritual. So there's one archer from the Swiss Alps, this is Paleolithic man, right? No, sorry, Neolithic man. Somebody traveled from Switzerland to Stonehenge, and the guy had terrible arthritis, except he dies there. So they guess he probably traveled all that way just because it was known as a healing site with its water. And third, early astrological observatory for the midsummer solstice, winter solstice. And thirdly, this sounds kind of strange, it was for worshiping God. So we found this ancient Greek writer who describes Stonehenge, that's where they would worship, quote unquote, the sun god. And he speaks about them coming together for healing and all this other stuff. So that's something else. So you're thinking, well, what are you talking about? But first I just want to mention, architecture is in the human DNA. We want to connect with God. We want architecture to connect us with our deceased, and we want it to be a source of healing. And the deceased part, and this sounds kind of strange, I'm getting off. You know how Neolithic man, they buried the dead with them? They made these huge megalithic structures, so the dead you could go and visit the dead. So architecture was also remembering your connection to those who have died. Why I mention that is that in the Catholic altar, what's in the stone of every Catholic altar? Really, we haven't changed in 10,000 years. When, the first thing the priest does and the deacon is we kiss the altar. The altar symbolizes Christ. We're kissing Christ. But because a relic, like we have, I think, 2 relics in our altar, we're kissing all the dead. Still, the altar is a place where we meet God and we meet the dead. In the book of Revelation, it says that the saints are under the altar. So it's just a very human thing that, wow, shouldn't religion not just connect with God, but connect with the dead? Now, I'm very critical, once again, throwing out my opinions, but I don't like evangelical worship with a rock concert. Because where do you find that anywhere in the Bible? What you find in the Bible is altar, altar, altar. How did Cain and Abel worship God? On an altar. If you notice, always in the Bible, how do human beings, from Genesis to the book of Revelation? In the book of Revelation, the center of heaven, there's a... All right. How do human beings worship? But on an altar. We share a meal with God. Nowhere does it say, just have a rock concert. Just play music. Yes, there was music played at all these services, but it was never music for music's sake. It was always an altar. So if the altar was a center of the temple, altar was a center of heaven, what should be the center of the Catholic Church? The altar. And it connects us with each other, connects us with the divine, connects us with dead. Architecture is supposed to do that. Now, next week I'm going to go where, guess what? In the Old Testament, God tells Moses, this is how you're supposed to build a temple. There's supposed to be 3 pieces of furniture in the temple because it reflects a gateway into heaven. And the one is altar. There's 2 others, but you'll have to come back next week. Now, why I was going off on altars is, I'm going to try and say this. Hypogeisium. Can't pronounce. It means place under the earth. This here is a 7,000-year-old burial site. That should really shock you. No, it's not 7,000. I just messed up. There's 7,000 burials in this site. But this is in Malta, oddly enough. And, that's Stonehenge. This is it means place beneath the earth. It's actually this huge, complex cathedral from Neolithic times. In Malta, they didn't have mountains, so they buried down and created a mountain. So it was this underground burial system with 7,000 burials. And oddly enough, this is the amazing part, it's from Neolithic times. And the shocking part is, look at this. This is all carved out. And so later you're going to have Roman columns, right? But before there's Roman columns, there's Neolithic columns. They carved these columns out. Doesn't that kind of shock you? They just didn't carve something out. They carved it out with columns, or this to me is amazing, columns and an apse and all these tunnels. So look how huge this place is. And it's all underground. Now, here's the odd part. They have vaulted ceilings. Shouldn't that really shock you, underground? They have vaulted ceilings and apse. Apse are going to be a big theme with me. My theme is I love an apse. An apse is a curved wall. So if we're in, this sounds kind of strange. If you're wondering where are you going, well, think about this. In Paleolithic times in the caves, they always had caves that weren't just astronomically orientated, but they're orientated towards sound, so that sound would project. And then they have these apse carved areas so that up where the altar is, the sound goes out. Now that's going to be important because guess what early Christians did? I'll give you a hint. I love an apse. Where the altar is. And they made it vaulted. They're not copying Romans or anything. Romans are copying them. And this is Neolithic. Isn't that just absolutely amazing? So you have these vaulted ceilings. And this is a place where, once again, to bury the dead and to come for healing and connection with the divine. And here's the really odd part. Remember from Paleolithic times, the statue they had always found in graves was the mother, they'd call it Venus or Mother Earth. Now they have one lying down in a death position. And when they buried the dead, I mentioned this, even ancient times when you'd bury the dead, they'd bury the dead as if they're sleeping with one arm. Isn't that bizarre? And they found her here. Now, this is her she's missing the top half, but she has a fringed skirt. But she's in this fetal position, and that was a burial position that they would bury, Neolithic people would bury their dead in. Here she's wearing a fringed skirt. Now, you're thinking, why does he go off on that? In the Holy Spirit is pictured as a woman in the Bible, and so like Lady Wisdom, it says in the Old Testament, that she goes out and sings to all people. And anyone who wants to hear truth hears her song. And she will make a feast for them. And this sounds kind of strange. The biblical idea is that Lady Wisdom is always calling all human beings, not just us good people, but has always been singing a song to every human. And this sounds kind of strange. Generation upon generation, it'll say. Generation upon generation, it takes to learn wisdom. So why not start with Paleolithic times of just starting a religious language? So people who say, well, I'm spiritual but not religious. Why would you be that? Alone and single, God is too small. If all you can learn of God is your tiny little lifespan, that's not much to learn. But what if you could say, well, wait, our idea is that Lady Wisdom has always been singing to humanity, generation upon generation, teaching a little bit more. So I love this image. And this is one of the oldest temples on earth. There's 4 different chambers, and here's all. In the worship areas, there's always an apse, there's always an altar. That's a base of one of them. And once again, spirals. I told you we love spirals. That little hole is going to be important for a second. You'll see. Here's an altar, again, with a place for purification with water before. Huge theme is going to be water, then altar. I'm going to change the way we do things because I think our holy water fonts are almost invisible. So you'll have to come next time. I'm going to make some big changes there. So when you walk in the church, the first thing you must see is water. And then these holes. You think they were trying to figure out why these holes were there, but they figured it out because of some evidence. Those holes were to tie up animals for sacrifices. And the altar is where you would share a meal. Now that's kind of interesting because, once again, altars are a big thing in the Bible, but when anybody has an altar is a table, but it's a table for a sacred meal, and you would basically have a barbecue, and you would eat part of it. Part of it would be burned up, and the part that burns up is for God. Does that make sense? Well, this is even before Judaism. You have altars and altars in all these places. The roots of a religion always seems to have an altar and a meal and spirals. Spirals meaning this place of transition. But I love the fact that they had these always these meal and altar. Now, here's the really shocking part. Then these hunters, found these little replicas of these temples in Malta in distant farming places. So that should strike you as strange. You know what that meant? People would journey to these temples, offer a sacrifice, and they'd have a little model of the temple to take back when they travel home. It'd be like you having a little model of St. Pius for your home. Because it's not like you're going to get to St. Pius every weekend. You could only do it every few years. Does that make sense? And this is Neolithic man. That temple played a big part in their life. So when people say, well, religion is just made up, it's so part of us. And once again, even in the caves, they track, and they're orientated certain openings towards astrological symbols. So what you conclude is, this sounds mean, why isn't religion taught as part of Paleolithic and Neolithic human history? Religion developed art and astronomy and architecture, and yes, rites for the dead. Secondly, you have always the theme of a cave, and a cave is a place of rebirth. From Peru to Madagascar, caves are often a place of rebirth. And I want to say that the cave is the church. Look at Plato's cave. If you remember your high school, you had to read that. Do you remember Plato's cave? Oh, that's a no. So Plato's cave, can I just tell you what it is really quick? But Plato is really kind of interested. Plato, Greek philosopher. He meets this Armenian soldier who's left for dead. And so they put him on a funeral pyre and light it. And the fire wakes him up. And the Armenian soldier tells this unbelievable story that when he died, he went through some sort of dark passageway to this place of light. Does that sound familiar? And Plato plays with that. And he says, what if our time on earth is just like living in a cave? And we think we see reality, but we don't. All we see is shadows from the true world on a wall. Does that make sense? And so all the truth is in the place of light. And so he makes this analogy that it gets into Greek philosophy, that really learning to see things as they are means learning to see things from the side of the light. And if you stumble out of the cave, You'll be blinded at first, but then your eyes will get used to everything, and then you'll see reality as it is. And that's the job of Greek philosophy, is to help you see the other world. Does that make sense? But even Plato's analogy of the cave is the coming out of the cave is rebirth. So religion is supposed to be this passageway into a new dawn, a new life, not just burying the dead, but a new way of seeing the world. So if that's true with megalithic structures, don't you think Catholic architecture should use a passageway? Shouldn't just the architecture be a passageway? And you're wondering, where is he going with this? Like, okay, a little bit of a criticism. Well, continue the passageway. This idea of passage. Notice in the Bible, then one theme of the Bible is passageway. Adam and Eve are kicked out of the Garden of Eden, and the rest of the story is them trying to travel back in. Abraham, he leads him and his clan to the promised land, even though it will be hundreds of years before they really get there. The Abraham story is a story to the promised land. What's a Jewish story? Journeying to the promised land, from Egypt to the promised land. And then they get to the promised land, they become corrupt, and then they take the pilgrimage all over, from Babylon back to the promised land. And the prophets say, oh, we're on a new promised land. Christ will take us to a new passage, a new promised land. And then when Christ comes, he starts in northern Israel and takes his disciples on this huge passage to Jerusalem. But then, if you pay attention, especially in the Gospel of Luke, he'll say, I have a lot further to go. Well, wait a minute. This whole time he's been wanting to get to Jerusalem. And then he has further to go? No, he's going to take us to heaven. Does that make sense? So, or the Jewish word for feast, there's actually a couple, but there's two. One of the Jewish words of feast would mean to eat. The other word in Hebrew for a feast is leg. And you think, leg? Yeah, because to really journey to the altar, it's a leg. It's a walk. Does that make sense? So you always have to walk before celebrating a Jewish feast. So this idea of a passageway became important. So I think, I'll get into this next time, but my criticism of St. Pius is that it was built as a lecture hall where you sit. And I want to take up the carpet because A, I hate it, but B, when you look at the altar, architecturally, you should have this feeling, and I'll get in this next week, I need to go that way. Does that make sense? Here, when you walk into our church, you think, I need to find a seat. You know what I mean? And so one big thing is playing with the aisle. I know we have 3 aisles, right? But in a church, you should make a main aisle so that just your feeling architecturally is that everything's being drawn towards the altar. Does that make sense? Not just the same carpet everywhere. So, some couple, I forget who, were showing me pictures from their vacation after Mass, and they were showing me this church in San Diego. And this sounds kind of strange. Beautiful altar. But you know what made the altar beautiful? The aisle. They had this cement polished that just, it drew your eye right to it. You had to walk there. Does that make sense? You just wanted to walk up that way. Why did ancient human beings always create these passageways before you get to the altar? And it gives directionality. I'll talk about that more next week. Third, you have this huge play with the sun and light. And I think, we'll get into this 2 weeks from now with Romanesque and Gothic. Ancient Catholics always played with a light theme. That here, they're tracking the stars and the light. But also, light should play with architecture. The problem with modern world is that we just flood everything with light, but it doesn't give a spiritual sense. Does that make sense? And then fourth, a concern about the afterlife. The study of anthropology is that all ancient religions were concerned about connection with the dead. and respect to the dead and a hope of an afterlife. When confronted with death of somebody you love, how did they connect with the dead? Through a meal, through offering a meal. Even Neanderthals had a meal in their funeral rites, if you remember that story. So death is and was our first primordial theological teacher. So it sounds kind of strange. I just think if you walk into a Catholic church, it should immediately connect you with the dead. And I know it sounds strange, but I'll get into this next time. But it's not enough just to have a relic in the altar. Like, we have a couple relics here at St. Pius, but you wouldn't know. They're kept in a closet. So, like, what I did at Holy Apostles is I put them on a wall so that the relics were there. Does that make sense? And then we had the statue with votive candles, and you can write down the name of a beloved deceased and light a candle. I want to get that here. Oh, we've already ordered them. So we're going to get those here because I just think architecturally it should be a connection with the dead. But it should also, architecturally, from ancient times, religion is not about just remembering the past, somebody who's died, but give direction in the future. So yeah, I want to change the aisle. And then, I know this sounds kind of strange, also just sacred places. Think about this, because the modern world will say, oh, you know, God is everywhere. I can worship God in the golf course. But think about this. These megalithic structures, Pharaoh's home was less impressive than the pyramids. The homes of Stonehenge and Newgrange were humble. They wanted sacred places to connect with the dead. Religion was this through art and architecture. Yeah, God may be everywhere, but I need to go to some place to concentrate on it. These places were kind of reminders of their true homeland. They put in the middle of farming tracts just so that all of them could be remembered. These megalithic dolmens were set in the middle of these architecture tracts and moved these huge stones miles and miles so that they could remember their homeland from generation to generation. Now, our true homeland is heaven, but that's why we need sacred spots. That's why Jacob takes his sons and see this pile of stones? This was the beginning. I thought this was a place where I could enter heaven. Does that mean? And it did change his life. And so he keeps coming back to it again and again and again. Now, just since we have 5 minutes, I want to talk about because I like Oh, here's more of the... Notice how they love spirals. It's just really weird that ancient man loved spirals so much. Oh, so this is ziggurat. How did you say it, Lydia? Oh, yeah, I don't like that word. Zapura? I think isn't that a Japanese beer? No, I'm serious. I think it is a Japanese beer. Lydia's probably mixing her... no, I can't get it in bigger. Zakura. I wonder why we say ziggurat. Oh, okay. Well, this is the shocking part. This famous archaeologist, Woolley, unearthed Ur. Now, Abraham came from the city of Ur, right? And so, before that, they thought, oh, that's just a made-up city. Then they discovered, no, it's a huge one. It's a ziggurat. And in Ur, they had this Samaritan king list that actually goes back to 2,400, 1,000 years, and then mentions a great flood. And then after the great flood, the kings rebuilt the city. So just mentioning, the most common anthropological story was the great flood. But also Ur is where cuneiform writing started. And writings of epic stories. So oddly enough, architecture, writing, that epic of Gilgamesh, was used first by religion. So then he finds this ziggurat, this mountain temple in the center of the city. And in it he found tombs buried with people, with symbols and artifacts. And here's the shocking part. Even dogs. People would be buried with their dog, which I just find it so funny because my dad was buried with his dog. So I know. And they found art and architecture and these writings. They wouldn't have done it unless there was some hope that they'd be reunited with their dead. Same thing with the dolmens. And I just mentioned that because I don't know, I love this image of mountain and connection and dead. And in a Catholic church, now next week I'm going to get into the Bible, what God says about it. So this is not what God says. I just think there's something very few human principles from anthropological times that should be in architecture. A play with light, apse, a place for the dead, a place for direction for the future. Does that make any sense? I find it incredible. So that's just the beginning of church and church architecture. Yeah. St. Mark's. I built a church, St. Mark's, yeah. I didn't like the design after I did it. Yeah, it's here in Idaho. Yeah.
Not here in Idaho, but here in Orlando?
I've only been here a year. No, we almost got a new church here at St. Pius. I told you that story. I told you a story about the fire. Last year I told you, right? Okay, people don't remember my stories. Why do I? So, last summer, was it last summer? I know, but I'm trying to think. Yeah, it was. When was it? Because after Christmas, I moved into the house. So it had to be, anyhow. It was summer, and there's a double doors that is my bedroom, and it's like late in the evening. It's like 8 o'clock. And I'm ready for bed. I'm in my underwear, and there's a cop at my... Yeah. There's a cop, in case you don't remember, a cop is there, and it's always the same. We've 3 times had to call the cops, and every time it's the same cop. It's like, Gabriel! Anyhow, some guy tried to set the church on fire, and the cop says, don't worry, I put out the fire. And I said, let me get this right. It was a schizophrenic guy. I said, let me get this right. I have a fully insured church that's falling apart, and you put out the fire. I could have got a whole new church, and you put out the fire. Do you know how hard it is to find a schizophrenic who can light a decent fire? So you ever put out that fire again, I'm reporting you to hell. Anyhow, so we almost got a new church. Okay, questions, opinions, objections? Same size as us. But, yeah. No, but it shows how intent they were about building something that would last. They could have built anything, because they did invent mud bricks. They wanted something that would last forever. That's how important architecture was. It was more important than their own homes. So they wanted something that that their children's children's children would come. Kathy. Yeah. And unite us with each other if we have this project. Yeah, you're right. And I hate to say this, just what you said. It's also intergenerational. I know, like, no offense to pop-up churches that, we're going to have a rock and roll church that lasts 5 years. There's nothing intergenerational. You don't go back, like my grandparents helped build that church. And, like my great-great-grandparents are buried there. There's nothing intergenerational. Just, it's entertaining me for now. So we'll have a strip mall, and we'll rent this place. All right. If you could clean your tables, think about signing up next week, and let's end with, in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. Thank you.